Hello everyone, I'm Alan Moscovitch and I'm professor of social work at Carleton University. Today I'm going to be talking to you about poverty in the Jewish community in Canada. Now, the data that we're using, and I am going to be presenting some data, is derived from the National Household Survey in 2011. A lot has been said about the National Household Survey. It replaced the long-form census. And some people watching may recall that there was quite a controversy around the replacement of the long-form census. So the consequence is that it makes it a little bit difficult to compare the data from 2011 to data from earlier years. Nonetheless, I'm going to show you what we can and can't know from this data. There is a difference between the way the NHS, the National Household Survey, was distributed. It went to many more households than the previous long-form census, but the response rate was much lower because it was on a voluntary basis. So it's hard to know the difference between what we might have had with the census and the National Household Survey. Now, in order to derive the data on the Jewish community, we use a combination of answers to the questions on ethnicity and religion, which are still there in the National Household Survey. Some people indicate they're Jewish by religion, some indicate they are ethnically Jewish, and some indicate both. Everyone is accepted, except those who indicate they are ethnically Jewish but have another religion. For 2011, because of the declining numbers, the data was adjusted a little to add a few other categories, such as people having a knowledge of Hebrew or Yiddish as a non-official language, people who were born in Israel, and people who have no religious affiliation but were living in Israel in 2006. In fact, unfortunately, those numbers, the numbers were not significantly altered by this so-called revised Jewish definition. If we look at this chart, which is derived from the data, what we see is numbers for the Jewish poor and the non-Jewish population. And we see that the Jewish population is pretty much at the same percentage level as the non-Jewish population. Just a word of clarification about where those percentages come from. The data that we're using is called the low-income cutoff. I won't go into the technical details of how those numbers are derived, but you can, if you're interested, go to Statistics Canada's website, look up low-income cutoff, and you'll get an explanation for who is included as poor and who is excluded from that category. The other qualification I want to add is that this is before tax data, not after tax data. It does make it possible in some ways to make the comparison to earlier years. But now that we have some social benefit programs that are delivered through the tax system, unfortunately this data does not take those numbers into account. So you may look at these numbers and say, well, I saw something in the newspaper about lower numbers. The lower numbers were based on the after-tax data. This is the before-tax data. It does give us an idea of the relative size of people who are poor and Jewish versus people who are poor and not Jewish. So if we look at the numbers, the percentage poor are 14.6% in the Jewish population, 14.8% in the Canadian non-Jewish population. So now you know the term low-income cutoff, or as it's abbreviated, LICO. And you see that in the heading on this table, which gives you the numbers historically for 1981 to 2011. And you see that the numbers for 2011 are a little bit larger, a higher percentage of people poor than previous. As I said, part of the difficulty here in making the comparison is that we're using a different survey for 2011 than for 2001 and previous years. Nonetheless, given changing economic conditions, it seems quite reasonable to suppose that there may actually be more people poor in 2011 than 2001. Okay, so that tells us that there's a progression, and instead of poverty being reduced, at least in the before tax numbers, it's actually been increasing. And this tells us a little bit about the age range of people who are poor. Not surprising, for example, to see 15 to 24, a relatively high number. Those are some of the folks in that age range are students living on low incomes while they're a student. More worrying is the relatively high numbers of children 0 to 14 who are poor. And then looking at the bottom, above average numbers in the 65 plus category. 15.7% of the Jewish population are poor. So about a little over 1 percentage point above the average. And this chart gives us an idea of where Jewish poverty is located by city. And I'll just highlight a couple of the results from this table. Toronto is a little bit below average. Winnipeg a little bit more or less at the average. Montreal and Vancouver are both well above the average. So it's telling us that the concentration of Jewish poor are likely in Toronto sorry, not in Toronto. They're likely in Montreal and in Vancouver in the country. And we combine that with the data on age, and we understand that that concentration is both children and youth, and it's also people who are 65 plus. So that gives us a very short picture of Jewish poverty in Canada. Thank you very much for taking the time to look at this video. And you can follow up further by connecting with the data at Statistics Canada or from the United Jewish Federations of Canada.